When judgment walks into a world built on prophecy, even the gods hold their breath. The dragons scream, the dead burn, the ancient laws shatter like glass. Skyrim thought it knew monsters until something arrived that doesn't forgive, doesn't negotiate, and never stops. So what happens when a land of legends faces the one thing prophecy never saw coming? The sky above Whiterun tore open like parchment held to flame, and the world beneath it began to scream. Eldric Vale stood upon the eastern battlement, his fingers still crackling with the residue of a ward spell he had cast 3 breaths too late. Below him, the market district burned. Smoke rose in black pillars that twisted against the wind, defying natural law, as if the very air had learned to hate. A dragon circled overhead, its scales the color of old blood and volcanic glass, each wingbeat sending shockwaves through the stone beneath Eldric's boots. The beast opened its jaws and the voice poured forth, not words but fundamental unmaking, a sound that existed before language and would endure after silence claimed the world. Buildings collapsed into their own foundations. People became ash before they could finish screaming. Eldric had studied the dragons in texts older than the Empire itself. He knew their names, their lineage, their place in the cosmic order of Akatosh's divine mistake. He knew the prophecy of the Dragonborn, the cycles of return, the careful balance between destruction and necessity. He knew that dragons were children of time itself, aspects of a god's regret given form and fury. He knew none of that mattered now. The dragon dove, and Eldric felt the temperature drop so suddenly that frost formed on his eyelashes. He raised his hands, weaving a spell of containment, threading magicka through the ancient patterns his master had beaten into his mind with repetition and consequence. The spell took shape, a lattice of blue light that should have stopped the beast's descent, should have given the guards time to fall back, should have bought precious seconds for the civilians still trapped in the burning plaza. The dragon passed through his spell like it was smoke. Eldric watched his best work dissolve against scales that predated the concept of defense. The beast landed in the center of the square with such force that the cobblestones liquefied, sending waves of molten rock outward in perfect circles. Guards died with their shields raised, their iron turned to slag before the heat could even register in their minds. A mother clutching her child simply ceased to exist, their bodies converted to carbon shadow on stone that would soon be dust. The dragon turned its head, regarding Eldric with eyes that held the patience of centuries. It drew breath for another shout, and Eldric knew with absolute certainty that he would die. His wards were exhausted. His magicka reserves were nearly depleted. The distance was too great to close, too short to escape. Then the sky broke again. This rupture was different. The first had been a tearing, the kind of dimensional wound that sometimes appeared near ancient barrows or in places where the veil between Mundus and oblivion grew thin. This was a puncture, surgical and absolute, as if something had simply decided that the barrier between worlds no longer applied to it. No light emerged. No sound heralded its opening. One moment there was sky, and the next there was a hole in reality through which impossibility fell. A figure dropped through the breach. Eldric's mind tried to categorize what he was seeing. Daedric armor, his first thought suggested, noting the green and bronze plating that covered the being from head to toe. But Daedric armor moved with eldritch grace, organic and flowing. This armor moved like a fortress. Each step was a statement of mass and inevitability. The figure hit the ground 50 feet from the dragon with enough force to crater the stone, and yet landed in perfect balance, already in motion before the impact had finished echoing. The dragon turned, confused for perhaps the first time in its long existence. Its instincts, honed across millennia, found no category for what stood before it. Not dragonborn, whose soul would sing with recognition, not mage, whose magicka would pulse with familiar resonance, not warrior, whose fear would flavor the air with copper and salt. The armored figure carried a weapon, but calling it a sword would be like calling a hurricane a breeze. The blade burned with energy that made Eldric's eyes water, even at this distance, a green fire that seemed to consume light itself rather than produce it. The design was wrong, too geometric, too precise, as if it had been forged by mathematics rather than hands. The dragon struck first, because that was what dragons did. The voice erupted from its throat, a word that meant ending, that carried within it every concept of destruction the draconic language had ever conceived. The shout hit the armored figure, and reality itself seemed to pause, waiting to see which force would prove more fundamental. The figure did not move, did not bend, did not even seem to notice. Eldric felt his understanding of magic crack like pond ice in spring. The Thuum was not a spell that could be resisted. It was not an element that could be blocked. It was the literal reshaping of reality through will-made word, the same power that had built the world and would one day unmake it. You could no more stand against it than you could hold back the sunrise with your hands. The armored figure began to walk forward. The dragon's eyes widened, an expression Eldric had never imagined seeing on such a creature. It drew breath again, deeper this time, pulling air from the burning city until people blocks away felt the pressure change in their skulls. The second shout was different, ancient even by draconic standards, a word that Eldric recognized from texts so old they were more legend than history. Mortality. The concept made sound. The dragon was not trying to destroy the figure, it was trying to remind it that it could die. The shout struck like the fist of a god. The figure's walk did not slow. Eldric saw the dragon's posture change, saw millennia of pride evaporate into something he had never associated with such beings: uncertainty. The creature launched itself backward, wings beating with desperate power, trying to gain altitude and distance. In all the histories, in all the songs and stories, dragons did not retreat. They ruled or they died. They did not know fear. This one was learning. The armored figure stopped walking. Its left arm rose with mechanical precision, and Eldric saw that it carried a second weapon, this one even more wrong than the blade. The device was all angles and purpose, designed with such singular focus that looking at it made him understand that it had only ever been meant to kill, no ceremony, no artistry, just the purest distillation of ending given physical form. Fire erupted from the weapon, but this was not the fire Eldric knew, not the flames he had conjured in his study or called forth in battle. This was fire as fundamental force, as unthinking inevitability. The air itself seemed to ignite between the weapon and the dragon, a column of heat so intense that it turned stone to glass in its wake. The blast struck the dragon's wing and punched through scales that had turned aside swords blessed by the divines themselves. The dragon screamed, and the sound carried no words, no power, just pain rendered absolute. It fell. The impact shook the entire city. Buildings that had survived the initial attack collapsed now from the shockwave. The dragon thrashed, trying to right itself, its remaining wing beating uselessly against air that had become thick with ash and the smell of burning metal. The armored figure walked toward it with the patience of tides, each step measured and inevitable. Eldric should have looked away. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to hide, to preserve what remained of his sanity. Instead, he watched. The dragon tried the voice again, but the words came out broken, desperate. Ice erupted from its mouth, then fire, then raw force, each shout more frantic than the last. The armored figure walked through them all. When ice formed on its armor, the plating simply cracked it away with the next step. When fire washed over it, the heat rolled off like water from oiled leather. When force struck it, the figure leaned into the blast as if walking against a strong wind. It reached the dragon. The creature reared back, jaws opening for one final word, perhaps the true name of Akatosh himself, a sound that would unmake reality if it had to. The armored figure moved faster than thought, its left arm swinging up to jam the strange weapon directly into the dragon's mouth. There was a moment of perfect stillness. Predator and prey locked in an embrace that felt older than time. Then the weapon fired. The dragon's head exploded from within, a catastrophic detonation that sent scales and bone fragments spinning through the air like deadly rain. But the destruction did not stop there. The body convulsed, and Eldrick saw something impossible. The dragon's flesh began to tear open, not from external damage, but from something erupting outward from inside. Light poured from the wounds, not the golden radiance of a soul returning to Akatosh, but a sickly green glow that seemed to infect the very air. The armored figure reached down and plunged its hand into the dragon's chest. Eldrick heard himself make a sound, something between a gasp and a retch. The figure tore something free, something that looked like a sphere of condensed energy wrapped in bone and sinew. For a moment, Eldrick thought he understood. The dragon's soul, the source of its power. But then the figure crushed the sphere in its gauntleted fist, and what spilled out was not divine essence, but something that burned with mechanical fury, energy that felt wrong against Eldrick's magical senses, as if it existed in defiance of Aetherius itself. The dragon's body began to dissolve, but not in the way Eldrick had seen before. When Dragonborn killed dragons, the flesh burned away cleanly, returning to whatever fundamental force had shaped it. This was corruption, a consumption that turned scales to oily smoke and bone to black residue that stained the ground like a curse. The process took less than 30 seconds, and when it was done, nothing remained but a shadow on stone and a smell like burning copper. The armored figure straightened and turned. Eldrick felt its gaze sweep across the city, across the burning buildings and the corpses and the survivors huddling in whatever shelter they could find. He could not see its eyes through the helmet, but he felt the weight of its attention like a physical thing, a pressure that made his chest tight and his hands shake. This was not the look of a savior surveying its rescued charges. This was judgment, cold and absolute, the gaze of something that had weighed the world and found it wanting. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then it began to walk, not toward the gates or the palace or any landmark Eldrick recognized. It walked southeast, toward the plains beyond the city, its stride never varying, its purpose as clear and terrible as dawn. Eldrick finally found his voice. "What are you?" The words came out as a whisper, but somehow he knew the figure heard them. It did not answer. It did not even pause. It simply walked through the ruined plaza, its armored boots crushing debris with each step, leaving footprints that smoked in the cooling stone. By the time the city guard rallied, by the time the Jarl's advisors began shouting contradictory orders, by the time anyone thought to question or pursue, the figure was gone. Only the crater remained, and the shadow where the dragon had died, and the memory of something that had looked at their world and seen only what needed to be ended. Eldrick stood on the battlement until long after dark, watching the smoke rise, trying to understand what he had witnessed. His training told him it was a Daedric champion, perhaps summoned by accident through the same breach that had brought the dragon. His instincts told him it was something far worse. His instincts were right. 3 miles from Whiterun, in a field where wheat had grown before the fires, the armored figure stopped. It stood perfectly still, head tilted back, regarding the stars with what might have been recognition or might have been contempt. Then it reached up and touched something on its helmet, a gesture so casual it seemed almost human. The armor's surface rippled with light, patterns of energy racing across its surface like veins of molten glass. Information flooded through systems that had no equivalent in this world, measurements and analyses that would have driven a mortal mind to madness. Atmospheric composition, gravity variance, dimensional resonance, arcane saturation, all of it catalogued, processed, and filed away in fractions of a second. The figure accessed deeper functions, calling up databases that held the compiled knowledge of civilizations that had risen and fallen before Tamriel's first stone was laid. It searched for a match, some equivalent to help it understand where the breach had taken it. Medieval technological base, check. Supernatural threat saturation, check. Entrenched ruling class exploiting systemic violence, check. Indigenous population exhibiting learned helplessness toward existential dangers, check. Hell. Not in the specific sense, not the particular dimension it had fought through for eons, but hell in the broader taxonomy, one of the infinite variations on the same fundamental theme, a prison disguised as a world where suffering had been industrialized and normalized, where the strong preyed on the weak with such regularity that the weak had built religions around accepting their fate. The figure that had once been a man named Flynn Taggart, that had been betrayed and transformed and reborn as something both less and infinitely more, lowered its head and surveyed the land before it. In the distance, more fires burned, not from dragons this time, but from bandits raiding a farmstead, their torches visible as dancing points of orange against the black. Beyond that, a necromancer's tower leaked purple light into the sky, the magical emissions visible to sensors that could track demonic energy across dimensional boundaries. To the north, a barrow pulsed with the slow heartbeat of Draugr stirring in their sleep, undead warriors bound to serve long-dead masters in an eternal cycle of violence and resurrection. Everywhere the Slayer looked, it saw chains. Some were forged of steel and some of tradition, some of magic and some of simple, exhausted acceptance, but all served the same purpose: to keep the prisoners docile, to make them believe their suffering had meaning, that their oppression was ordained by forces too vast to question. The Slayer had spent eternity breaking chains. It began to walk again, and the ground beneath its feet cracked like ice over deep water. Each step was a rejection, a statement written in fractured stone that said this world's rules no longer applied. The Slayer moved toward the burning farmstead, toward the screams that cut through the night like knives, and the air around it began to shimmer with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. Behind it, in Whiterun, Eldrick finally left the battlement and descended to the palace, where the Jarl and his advisors were already arguing about what the appearance meant, what it signified for prophecy and politics, and the careful balance of power that kept Skyrim from tearing itself apart. They would argue for hours, then days, crafting elaborate theories and counter-theories, each more complex than the last. They were all wrong. The truth was simpler and more terrible than they could imagine. The Slayer had not come to save them or rule them or even to help them. It had come because the breach between dimensions had deposited it here, and having arrived, it had recognized what this world truly was. Another hell that needed to be cleansed, and the Slayer had never left a hell standing. The bandits at the farmstead died so quickly that they barely had time to register the armored figure's approach. The first lost his head to a blade that moved faster than conscious thought. The second was torn apart by hands that could shatter dragon bone. The third tried to run and made it 6 steps before a burst of green fire reduced him to ash and fragments. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds, and when it was over, the Slayer stood in the center of the burning yard, surrounded by bodies that no longer resembled anything human. The family huddled in their burning home, a man and woman and 2 children, watched through gaps in the wood as their attackers were obliterated. They did not cheer or thank the gods or even feel relief. They felt terror so pure it bordered on religious awe, because they understood in that moment that they had witnessed something that would change everything, that had changed everything simply by existing. The Slayer did not approach the house or check for survivors or offer any gesture of comfort. It simply turned and walked toward the necromancer's tower, its sensors having already catalogued the Lich's energy signature and classified it as a priority target. The family watched it go, and the father, a man who had fought in the Great War and seen things that still woke him screaming, began to pray. Not to Talos or Akatosh or any of the 9 divines. He prayed that the armored thing would leave their world as suddenly as it had arrived, that its purpose would be fulfilled elsewhere, that Skyrim would be spared whatever judgment it clearly embodied. His prayers, like so many others in the nights to come, would go unanswered. The Slayer walked through the night, and hell prepared to learn that it was not alone in the business of eternal damnation, that there existed a force that had refined punishment into an art form, that had learned to make torment itself scream for mercy. Skyrim was about to receive an education in the difference between suffering and retribution, and the lesson would be written in fire and blood and the shattered remnants of every chain it had ever forged. The Necromancer's Tower had stood for 73 years, a spike of black stone thrust into the earth like a nail hammered through the skin of the world. Its builder, a Breton mage named Corvus Tharn, had died screaming in the initial ritual that had transformed him into a lich, his soul shredded and reconstituted into something that could no longer remember what warmth felt like. He had considered this an acceptable price for immortality, for the power to reshape life and death according to his will, for the freedom to pursue knowledge without the tiresome limitation of mortality. He was reconsidering this position. The tower's defenses had been engineered over decades, layer upon layer of magical protection that would have given an entire circle of mages pause, wards that could deflect master-level destruction spells, bindings that would rip the soul from any intruder's body before they reached the third floor, animated guardians constructed from the bones of dragons and giants, each one a masterwork of necromantic binding. Corvus had tested these defenses personally, had watched adventurers and rival mages shatter themselves against his protections like waves against obsidian. The Slayer walked through the front door, and the wards simply ceased to exist. Corvus felt it happen from his sanctum at the tower's peak, a sudden absence where his protective weaves should have been, not dispelled, not overwhelmed, simply gone, as if something had reached into reality and deleted them from existence. He reached out with his necromantic senses, trying to understand what force could have accomplished such a thing, and touched a mind that made him recoil in existential horror. It was not a mind at all. It was a function, a purpose so singular and absolute that consciousness had become redundant. Looking into it was like staring into a furnace that burned with nothing but the concept of ending that had transcended thought and become pure murderous will. Corvus began preparing his escape portals, fingers of bone and withered flesh weaving patterns in the air that would tear open pathways to prepared sanctuaries scattered across Tamriel. He had not survived 73 years by fighting battles he could not win. Whatever was climbing his tower, it was not something he wanted to face. The first-floor guardians attacked with the mindless efficiency of undead that knew neither fear nor hesitation. 6 skeletal warriors, each animated with a spark of the warrior's former skill, armed with weapons that could cleave through steel plate. They had killed 3 times their number in previous intrusions, moving with coordination no living fighters could match. The Slayer met their charge with a weapon Corvus's scrying could not identify, some kind of mechanical launcher that fired what appeared to be small metallic spheres. The spheres struck the undead warriors and detonated, but not with fire or force. They exploded into expanding clouds of what Corvus's enhanced vision identified as consecrated plasma, energy that had been baptized in something that made his necromantic bindings scream in protest. The skeletons did not simply fall apart. They were annihilated, every bone reduced to powder so fine it hung in the air like mist, every binding shredded at the fundamental level. Corvus felt the destruction echo through his connection to the tower, felt the backlash like teeth biting into his essence. The Slayer walked through the settling dust and began climbing the spiral stairs. Corvus activated the second-floor defenses, a mechanism of his own design that flooded the stairwell with poison gas thick enough to kill a giant in seconds. He watched through scrying as the green fog rolled down the stairs like a liquid, engulfing the armored figure completely. The Slayer did not slow or even seem to notice, its stride unchanged, walking through toxin that should have liquefied its lungs. The third floor held his prize guardians, a pair of Draugr death overlords he had personally excavated from a barrow older than the Dragon War. Each one had been a king in life, and in death they wielded the voice with enough power to collapse stone walls. They stood at the top of the stairs, waiting with the patience that only the undead could muster. The Slayer emerged from the poison fog, and the Draugr unleashed their shouts simultaneously, a coordinated strike that combined force with fire, a wall of destructive energy that should have reduced anything mortal to ash and vapor. The Slayer caught the shout. Corvus did not understand what he was seeing. The Thu'um was not a physical thing that could be grabbed. It was reality alteration through will-made word, through cosmic authority crystallized into sound. You could no more catch it than you could catch the concept of gravity. The Slayer's gauntleted hand closed on the shout as if it were a thrown spear, and the energy crumpled around its fist like burning paper. The flames extinguished, the force dissipated. The very sound seemed to die mid-syllable, strangled into silence. The Draugr death overlords, who had walked through empires and seen the rise and fall of civilizations, experienced something they had not felt since their first death: uncertainty. The Slayer did not give them time to process this. It launched itself up the remaining stairs with such explosive force that the stone steps shattered under its feet, crossing the distance in a single bound that seemed to defy everything Corvus understood about mass and momentum. Its left hand caught the first Draugr by the throat, lifting the ancient king off the ground with casual strength that made the undead warrior's armor creak in protest. The Slayer tore the Draugr's jaw from its skull with a single wrenching motion, then drove the bone fragment into the thing's eye socket with enough force to punch through the back of its skull. The Draugr thrashed, its hands scrabbling uselessly at the armored wrist that held it, but its strength meant nothing. The Slayer had fought things that could crack planets, had matched force with demons whose muscles were forged from the suffering of millions. An ancient Nord king, no matter how powerful in life, was barely an inconvenience. The second Draugr raised its ancient weapon, a greatsword that hummed with frost enchantments old enough to have been placed there by mages who had learned directly from the dragon priests themselves. It swung with enough force to cleave through stone pillars, the blade trailing ice crystals in the air. The Slayer caught the sword with its right hand, the blade stopping dead against its palm as if it had struck a mountain. Frost spread across the armor, beautiful and deadly patterns of ice that should have frozen blood and shattered bone. The Slayer looked down at the spreading ice, tilted its head slightly as if considering something mildly interesting, then closed its fist. The ancient blade shattered like glass, fragments of ensorcelled steel exploding outward with enough force to pepper the walls with shrapnel. The Draugr stared at its ruined weapon, its undead mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The Slayer drove its fist through the Draugr's chest plate, through the desiccated flesh beneath, through the spine, punching entirely through the body and out the back. The Draugr spasmed once, some final instinct trying to activate, then went still as the Slayer tore its spine out through the exit wound, still holding the first Draugr in its other hand. Corvus watched both of his prize guardians reduced to broken debris in less than 15 seconds, and felt something he thought he had excised from his nature when he became a lich: panic. He intensified his work on the escape portal, pouring power into the spell matrix with desperate focus, knowing now that every defense between him and the armored intruder was merely buying him seconds. The Slayer dropped the Draugr corpses and continued climbing, moving through the 4th and 5th floors without slowing. Corvus had filled these levels with traps, with magical wards, with animated constructs of bone and sinew, with every trick and technique he had accumulated over 7 decades of necromantic study. None of it mattered. The Slayer walked through it all with the inevitability of a glacier, destroying everything that moved, ignoring everything that did not. Spike traps that should have impaled it simply bent against its armor. Soul trap crystals that attempted to rip away its essence shattered without effect, as if the Slayer's soul was something too fundamental to be contained. Magical barriers designed to repel any physical force simply ceased to function when it walked into them. reality itself apparently unable to maintain the distinction between barrier and vacuum when confronted with the Slayer's presence. By the time it reached the 6th floor, Corvus's portal was ready. The Lich grabbed his most precious research notes, items that represented decades of work, and stepped toward the shimmering gateway that would carry him to safety in a barrow 300 miles north. The portal collapsed. Corvus spun, searching for the cause, and saw that the Slayer had simply entered the same floor. That was all. The armored figure had walked into the room, and the dimensional energies that Corvus had so carefully woven had simply unraveled, as if proximity to this thing made complex magic impossible to maintain. "What are you?" Corvus's voice was dust and decay, unused for years except to command the dead. "What manner of Daedra claims such power?" The Slayer did not answer. It began walking toward him with that same measured stride, each step absolutely certain. Corvus raised both hands and channeled everything he had, every scrap of stolen life force, every fragment of power he had hoarded across 73 years. He wove destruction and entropy, binding spells of decay that could age stone to dust in seconds. He summoned spectral warriors from the soul cairn itself, borrowing power from ideal masters with promises he had no intention of keeping. He unleashed torrents of necromantic energy that turned the air black with the stench of graves and rot. The Slayer walked through it all. When Corvus's most powerful destruction spell struck the armor, it simply absorbed the energy, the green plating glowing slightly brighter as if feeding on the assault. When spectral warriors materialized and lunged, the Slayer destroyed them with the same weapon it had used on the skeletal guardians. Each consecrated plasma burst, erasing the summoned dead so thoroughly that not even the soul cairn could reclaim them. Corvus tried to flee physically, his lich body moving with unnatural speed toward a window he could throw himself from, knowing he could survive the fall and perhaps lose this hunter in the wilderness. He made it 3 steps before the Slayer crossed the intervening space, in a blur of motion that Corvus's enhanced perception could barely track. A gauntleted hand closed on the back of his robes and lifted him off his feet with effortless strength. Corvus twisted, trying to cast one final spell, a curse of dissolution that would unmake the Slayer's armor at the molecular level. The Slayer's other hand grabbed Corvus's skull and squeezed. The Lich's cranium crumpled like parchment, ancient bone that had been reinforced with necromantic energies collapsing under pressure that could crush stone to diamond. Corvus felt his consciousness fracture, felt the bindings that held his soul to his undead flesh begin to tear. He reached out desperately, trying to trigger the phylactery hidden in his sanctum, the soul jar that would allow him to resurrect even from complete destruction. The Slayer seemed to sense this, its helmeted head turning toward the sanctum door. Still holding the disintegrating lich, it walked to the door and kicked it open with such force that the reinforced oak and iron barrier exploded inward, the metal hinges liquefying from the impact shock. Inside, on a pedestal of obsidian, sat the phylactery, a crystal sphere that pulsed with sickly purple light, containing the true essence of Corvus Tharn, the kernel of his being that made resurrection possible. The Slayer threw the Lich's body aside and walked to the pedestal. It looked at the phylactery for a long moment, sensors analyzing the necromantic binding, the soul trap mechanism, the fundamental principles that allowed a consciousness to persist beyond death through the imprisonment of others. Then it picked up the sphere and crushed it. The phylactery did not simply break, it imploded, collapsing in on itself with a sound like reality tearing, and from the wreckage poured not just Corvus's soul but the souls of every victim he had ever consumed, every death he had fed upon to fuel his immortality. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, all screaming as they were suddenly freed from their prison. Corvus's lich body began to crumble, the bindings that held it together dissolving now that the phylactery was gone. He tried to speak, to beg or curse or demand explanation, but his jaw had already turned to powder. The last thing he saw before his consciousness fragmented into oblivion was the Slayer standing over him, silent and absolute, judging him without mercy and finding him wanting. The tower began to collapse the moment Corvus died. All of the necromantic bindings that had sustained it for 73 years failed at once, like a body whose heart had stopped. The black stone began to crack, releasing pressures that had been contained for decades. The Slayer walked through the crumbling structure with the same unchanging stride, exiting the front door just as the tower's peak began to fold inward. It stood in the field outside, watching as the entire structure imploded, crushing down into its own foundation, burying every experiment and atrocity Corvus had committed in tons of broken stone. Dust rose into the night sky, and for a moment everything was silent except for the settling debris. Then the Slayer turned and looked north, toward the mountains that loomed against the stars. Its sensors had detected something during the tower assault, a pattern of energy that matched profiles from countless other hells it had fought through. Organized corruption, institutionalized suffering, power structures built on the enslavement of the weak. More work to be done. The Slayer began walking, and behind it, the ruins of the necromancer's tower burned with green fire that would not extinguish for 3 days, a beacon visible for miles that would draw pilgrims and scholars and the simply curious. They would find nothing but ash and shattered stone, and in the center of the destruction, footprints burned into rock that had been heated past its melting point. Some would call it divine intervention. Others would whisper about Daedric incursion or the return of ancient heroes. A few would recognize the truth, that something had judged Corvus Tharn and found him guilty, that justice had been administered with such absolute finality that even the possibility of resurrection had been erased. None of them would understand that this was just the beginning, that the entity responsible had barely begun its work, that every corrupt mage and bandit lord and Daedric champion in Skyrim had just been marked for termination. The Slayer walked through the night, and the land itself seemed to sense its passing, animals fleeing from paths it had not yet taken, ancient stones resonating with frequencies that made them weep mineral tears. This was not the measured tread of a warrior seeking glory or a champion following destiny's call. This was extermination in motion, judgment rendered absolute, and it would not stop until every chain in this world lay broken or the Slayer itself was destroyed. Neither outcome seemed likely. In Whiterun, Eldric Vael sat in his tower chamber, surrounded by books and scrolls and astronomical charts, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. His hands shook as he wrote, quills scratching across parchment in the angular script of magical notation. He had seen the armored figure through scrying, had watched it walk through the necromancer's tower as if the entire structure was no more substantial than fog. Everything he knew about magic, about the limitations of physical force, about the fundamental rules that governed how power functioned in this world, had been rendered obsolete in the span of one night. He wrote until dawn, documenting every detail, knowing that someone had to bear witness to what was coming. Because Eldric understood, in the way that scholars sometimes see patterns others miss, that the armored figure was not simply a visitor or an accident of dimensional travel. It was a reckoning. And Skyrim, for all its dragons and Daedra and ancient evils, had never faced anything like this before. The sun rose over a world that was already different, though most people would not realize it yet. In taverns across Skyrim, guards and merchants would wake and begin their day, unaware that the fundamental nature of their reality had shifted. In the courts of Jarls and the halls of mages, advisors would continue their endless debates about politics and prophecy, blind to the fact that prophecy itself had become irrelevant. The Slayer walked on, tireless and unstoppable, and with each step, the countdown to Skyrim's transformation ticked closer to zero. In the Ratway beneath Riften, a group of thieves huddled around a smuggler who had just arrived from Whiterun, his hands still shaking as he described what he had seen. They laughed at first, dismissing his story as the ravings of someone who had sampled too much skooma. But something in his eyes made them stop. made them listen, made them realize that whatever was coming, it was not going to respect the old rules that had kept them safe in the shadows. In the depths of Blackreach, the Falmer stirred in their endless darkness, their ruined senses detecting vibrations that carried a promise of violence, unlike anything they had encountered in their millennia of subterranean existence. They gripped their weapons tighter and retreated deeper into the earth, some instinct warning them that the surface world was no longer safe, that something walked above that made even the eternal darkness seem like sanctuary. And in oblivion, in the Daedric realms that existed perpendicular to reality, several princes paused in their eternal machinations and turned their attention toward Mundus. They felt the disturbance, the presence of something that resonated with powers they recognized but could not place, something that carried the stench of hell but was not of any hell they knew. Mehrunes Dagon, Prince of Destruction, reached toward the mortal world with senses that could unravel cities, trying to understand what force had entered his domain of influence. His consciousness touched the Slayer's wake and recoiled, burned by contact with a purpose so absolute that it made his own destructive nature seem almost playful by comparison. Molag Bal, Lord of Domination, probed deeper, intrigued by the possibility of a new soul to corrupt and enslave. His power slithered through dimensions, seeking purchase on the Slayer's essence. What he found made him withdraw with something that, in a Daedric prince, might almost be called caution. The Slayer was not prey, was not potential, was not anything that could be negotiated with or corrupted or even properly understood. It was anathema, a walking rejection of every principle the Daedra embodied, and it had arrived in a world they considered their personal hunting ground. They would learn to regret its presence, but not yet. For now, in the early hours after its arrival, the Slayer was simply walking, gathering data, categorizing threats, building a hierarchy of targets that would guide its actions in the nights to come. Every bandit camp registered, every necromancer's lair catalogued, every Daedric shrine marked, every dragon sighting filed away. The Slayer had fought through infinite variations of hell, had learned to recognize its patterns and structures, had developed a methodology for dismantling it piece by piece. This world might have different aesthetics, might wrap its horrors in Nordic tradition and Elder Scrolls prophecy, but underneath it all, it was the same. Parasites feeding on the suffering of the weak, power consolidating in the hands of monsters, systems designed to perpetuate violence while convincing the victims that their pain had meaning. The Slayer had ended those systems before, had burned hells so thoroughly that even their echoes screamed for mercy. Skyrim would be no different. The morning light spread across the land, illuminating forests and mountains, cities and ruins, all of it beautiful in the way that prisons can be beautiful when you do not understand that you are trapped. Farmers woke and went to their fields. Merchants opened their stalls. Guards changed shifts on city walls. And life continued with the assumption of continuity, the belief that tomorrow would be fundamentally like today. They were wrong. The Slayer had arrived, and nothing would be the same again. In a cave system 20 miles north of Whiterun, a coven of vampires felt the sunrise and retreated to their coffins, secure in the knowledge that the day belonged to mortals and the night to them, that this balance had held for centuries and would hold for centuries more. They would not survive the week. In solitude, the Jarl's court received word of the dragon's death and the strange armored figure that had killed it. Advisors debated what it meant, whether it was dragonborn or Daedric champion or something else entirely. They drafted messages to other holds, seeking information and guidance. Their messages would arrive too late to matter, and in a barrow older than the dragon war itself, a dragon priest stirred behind a mask of cursed metal, sensing that something had changed in the world above. The dead had been disturbed. Ancient bindings had been broken. The careful balance that kept the undead dormant was beginning to crack. The dragon priest began to wake, gathering power for the first time in millennia. preparing to remind the world why his kind had once been feared above all other servants of the dragons. He would learn that fear was no longer the exclusive province of the ancient dead. The Slayer walked on, and the world held its breath, waiting for the moment when everyone would understand what Eldrick Vael had already begun to suspect, that they had not been saved, they had been judged. And judgment, once passed, could not be appealed, only endured. The morning aged into afternoon, and in taverns across Skyrim, the first stories began to spread. Travelers spoke of green fire on the horizon, of towers collapsing for no apparent reason, of bandits found torn apart in ways that suggested violence beyond mere combat. The stories contradicted each other, merged and split like water flowing around stones, but they all carried the same underlying current of unease. Something was moving through Skyrim, something unstoppable, and it had not come to parley or negotiate or join any faction. It had come to cleanse. The Slayer reached the base of the throat of the world as the sun hung midway to zenith, its sensors analyzing the mountain that dominated Skyrim's geography like a nail driven through the heart of the land. The energy readings were complex, layers upon layers of ancient power woven into the stone itself. At the peak, something resided that registered on multiple spectrums, divine and draconic, and something older than both. The Slayer filed this away and continued east, following signatures that indicated active threats rather than dormant ones. The mountain would wait. Mountains always did. 3 miles from the base, it encountered its first patrol. A squad of Stormcloak soldiers, 8 strong, moving through a narrow valley with the confident carelessness of warriors who had fought in these lands for years. They saw the Slayer when it was still 100 yards distant, that distinctive green armor impossible to miss against the grey stone and brown grass. The patrol leader, a Nord veteran named Hjormir, raised his hand to halt his squad. Something about the figure bothered him, set off instincts honed through a decade of warfare. The way it moved, each step absolutely certain, with no adjustment for terrain or threat assessment, either supremely confident or supremely stupid. Halt. Hjormir's voice carried authority born from years of giving orders that meant life or death. Identify yourself. The Slayer did not slow or respond. It simply continued walking toward them, that same measured stride, as if the armed soldiers were no more significant than the stones beneath its feet. Hjormir felt his unease sharpen into something colder. I said, halt. In the name of Ulfric Stormcloak, you will stop and state your business. The Slayer walked on. One of the younger soldiers, a boy barely past his first real battle, nocked an arrow and drew his bow. Sir, should I? Hold, Hjormir commanded, but his hand was already moving to his axe. Something was very wrong. In all his years of soldiering, he had never encountered someone who simply ignored a direct military challenge. Even the most arrogant mages or Thalmor officers would at least acknowledge a direct order, even if only to sneer at it. This thing just walked. When the Slayer was 30 yards away, Hjormir made his decision. Shields up, formation Gamma. The squad moved with practiced efficiency, veterans forming a shield wall while the 2 archers took position behind. It was a formation that had stopped charging mammoths and held against Imperial cavalry charges. The shields locked together with the solid sound of wood and iron meeting, creating a barrier that announced its own impregnability. The Slayer did not adjust its approach. It walked directly toward the center of the shield wall, its stride never varying. Hjormir felt sweat on his palms despite the cool air. Fire, he commanded. 2 arrows leapt from bows, their paths true, striking the armored figure center mass. The arrows shattered against the green plating, fragmenting like they had struck solid stone rather than armor. Not deflected, not embedded, simply destroyed on impact. Ready spears. Hjormir's voice had gone tight. Whatever this thing was, it was not stopping, and the shield wall was less than 10 yards away now. The Slayer hit the formation like a siege weapon. It did not crash into the shields or attempt to break through with main force. Instead, it simply reached out with both hands and grabbed the top edges of two shields, then pulled them apart with such overwhelming strength that the men holding them were yanked forward, their feet leaving the ground as they were flung aside like rag dolls. The shield wall dissolved in less than 2 seconds. Men stumbled, trying to reform, but the Slayer was already among them, moving with a speed that Hyomir's combat experience told him was impossible for something that heavily armored. It grabbed one soldier by the face and slammed his head into the ground with such force that the man's helmet crumpled and his skull beneath it made sounds that Hjormir would hear in nightmares. A sword struck the Slayer's back, a solid blow delivered with full strength by a warrior who had killed his share of enemies. The blade bounced off the armor, and the impact jarred up the wielder's arms hard enough to make him drop the weapon. The Slayer turned with mechanical precision and backhanded the soldier, its gauntleted fist connecting with enough force to snap the man's neck and send him spinning through the air. Hjormir raised his axe and brought it down in a two-handed overhead strike that had cleaved through shield and armor in the past. The Slayer caught the axe handle with one hand, stopping it dead, then pulled it and Hjormir forward. Its other hand shot out and caught Hjormir's throat, lifting the veteran soldier off his feet with effortless strength. Hjormir stared into that green visor, trying to see eyes or some hint of humanity, some indication that he could reason or negotiate or surrender. He saw nothing but his own reflection in polished metal, distorted and small. "Please," he managed to choke out. "We're just soldiers, following orders." The Slayer's grip tightened fractionally, and Hjormir felt his windpipe begin to collapse. His vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in at the edges. His last coherent thought was that they had never stood a chance, that whoever or whatever this thing was, it existed on a level so far beyond human combat that resistance was not just futile, but meaningless. The Slayer dropped his body and turned to the remaining soldiers. 2 were still alive, both wounded, trying to crawl away with broken limbs and bleeding wounds. The Slayer walked to each one systematically and ended them with single strikes, precise and clinical, then stood in the center of the carnage and accessed its targeting systems. The soldiers had been marked as hostile combatants. Threat assessment: minimal. Classification: armed insurgents participating in systematic violence. Judgment: terminal. The Slayer's protocols did not distinguish between soldiers following orders and demons following their nature. Both enabled systems of suffering. Both maintained the prison. Both were complicit in the continuation of hell. Both were guilty. It continued walking, leaving 8 bodies in the narrow valley, their deaths so swift that the blood was still spreading across the stones. Carrion birds would find them before nightfall, and other patrols would discover the remains eventually, and the message would spread through both Stormcloak and Imperial ranks that something new was in play, something that did not honor the rules of war or the sanctity of uniform, something that killed because the killing was necessary, not because it felt anything about the act. 20 miles to the east, in a fortress carved into the mountain itself, a bandit lord named Krev the Red felt a chill pass through him despite the roaring fire in his hall. He was a large man, powerful and cruel, who had built his small empire through violence and intimidation. 30 bandits called him Lord, and the villages in his territory paid tribute or burned. He had no reason to feel fear in his own hall, surrounded by armed men who had proven their loyalty through shared atrocity. Yet he felt it anyway, a cold certainty settling in his gut that something was coming, something that would not be stopped by walls or weapons or the reputation he had spent years cultivating through calculated brutality. He shook off the feeling and called for more mead, drowning the unease in alcohol and the laughter of his men. They told stories of their recent raids, competed to outdo each other in tales of cruelty and conquest, secure in the belief that their fortress was impregnable and their strength unmatched. They had approximately 6 hours left to live. The Slayer's sensors had catalogued their fortress, classified it as a high-priority target based on energy signatures that indicated multiple hostile combatants and evidence of recent violence. The thermal readings showed pyres that had burned within the last day, probably corpses. Structural analysis revealed weak points in the stone walls. Guard rotation patterns were logged and analyzed. By the time the Slayer reached the base of the mountain, it had already planned 17 different approach vectors, calculated optimal entry points, and projected casualty rates. The bandits' defensive position meant nothing. Their numbers meant nothing. Their confidence meant nothing. They were already dead. They just did not know it yet. The Slayer began to climb, its armored hands finding purchase in stone that would have defeated normal climbers, each movement perfectly calculated for efficiency. It did not need rest or food or even air beyond what its suit could recycle. It was, in all ways that mattered, a force of nature wearing armor, and forces of nature did not negotiate. As the sun began its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across Skyrim's tortured landscape, the Slayer climbed toward its next target, patient and inevitable as entropy. Behind it, the bodies in the valley had gone cold. Word of their deaths had not yet spread. The necromancer's tower was still smoldering. The dragon's remains had been scavenged by creatures too small to understand what they were eating. And across Skyrim, in holds and camps and hidden sanctuaries, people went about their lives, unaware that their world was being systematically dismantled by something that had looked at their suffering and decided it could no longer be tolerated. The Slayer did not care if they understood, did not need their gratitude or even their awareness. It had a function, a purpose that had been burned into its essence through transformations that would have shattered lesser beings. End hell. All of it. Every variation, every incarnation, every instance where suffering had been industrialized and evil had been allowed to flourish. Skyrim qualified, and so Skyrim would burn. Not with the random destruction of dragons or the calculated cruelty of Daedric princes, but with the methodical thoroughness of something that had learned to make extinction an art form. The fortress drew closer with each handhold, each perfectly placed grip pulling the Slayer higher up the mountain face. Inside, Krev the Red laughed at a joke he would not remember tomorrow, surrounded by men who would not see tomorrow. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, and the Slayer climbed on, tireless and certain, a green shadow against grey stone, ascending toward judgment that could no longer be avoided. The fortress of Krev the Red had been built into the mountainside by people who understood that height meant power, that controlling the narrow pass below meant controlling trade and travel and life itself. Those ancient builders were long dead, their names forgotten, but their work remained, repurposed now by men who had learned that cruelty was profitable and that fear could be farmed like crops. They had built well, too well. The fortress would contain the screaming. The Slayer reached the outer wall as the last light drained from the sky. No guards patrolled the battlements. Why would they? The walls were sheer cliff face on 3 sides, accessible only by a single switchback path that could be defended by 2 men against an army. The 4th side opened onto the narrow pass, where watchtowers gave clear sight lines for miles in either direction. The Slayer had climbed the cliff. It pulled itself over the battlement with motions that betrayed no effort or strain, landing in a crouch on stone that had last felt footsteps 6 hours ago during the evening rotation change. The courtyard below was empty, save for a few supply crates and a well that had gone dry years back. Light spilled from the main hall, and with it came the sounds of celebration, of men drunk on their own invincibility. The Slayer accessed its tactical systems and overlaid thermal imaging across visual input. 32 heat signatures in the main hall. 4 more in separate chambers, probably guard rotations resting between shifts. 2 in what registered as a storage cellar, their heat signatures cooler, their vital signs weak, prisoners or slaves. Classification complete. 36 hostile combatants. 2 potential non-combatants requiring assessment. The Slayer dropped from the wall into the courtyard, landing with barely a sound despite the mass of its armor. It crossed to the main hall door in 3 strides, stopped, tilted its head as if listening to something only it could hear. Inside, Krev the Red was telling a story about a merchant caravan they had ambushed last month, describing in detail how they had dealt with the guards and what they had done to the merchant's daughter before burning the wagons. His men laughed and drank and added their own embellishments, each trying to prove themselves more vicious than the last. The Slayer placed its hand against the door, sensors analyzing the structure. Heavy oak reinforced with iron bands, strong enough to withstand a battering ram. The hinges were set deep into the stone frame, designed to hold against assault. The Slayer gripped the door's edge and simply tore it from its frame, metal screaming as it ripped free from anchors that had held it for generations. The noise was catastrophic, a shriek of tortured metal and splintering wood that cut through the hall's revelry like a blade. 32 faces turned toward the entrance as the Slayer threw the ruined door aside and stepped through. For a moment, perfect silence held. The bandits stared at the armored figure standing in their doorway, trying to process what they were seeing. In that moment of frozen time, some part of Krev's animal brain understood what was about to happen, understood with absolute certainty that everything he had built was about to end. He opened his mouth to shout orders, to rally his men, to activate some defensive plan. The Slayer raised its left arm and the fortress learned what modern weapons could do to medieval fortifications. The shoulder-mounted launcher deployed with mechanical precision, target lock systems painting every heat signature in the hall. Micro-rockets streaked across the chamber, each one smaller than a finger but guided by targeting computers that never missed. They struck with precision, detonating against flesh and bone and furniture, tearing through the packed hall like a scythe through wheat. The first volley killed 18 men before they could even stand. Bodies exploded, limbs separated, blood-painted walls that had stood for centuries. The survivors scrambled for weapons, training and instinct overriding the terror that threatened to freeze them. The Slayer walked into the carnage. A bandit rushed it with a war axe, screaming rage and fear in equal measure. The Slayer caught the axe mid-swing, its hand closing around the blade, then drove its other fist into the man's chest with enough force to rupture every organ. The bandit's eyes bulged and he coughed blood, then crumpled as the Slayer released him. 2 more came from the sides, trying to flank, working with the coordination of men who had fought together before. The Slayer grabbed one by the throat and used him as a bludgeon against the other, swinging the first bandit's body hard enough that both men's bones shattered on impact. It dropped the bodies and continued forward, wading into the press of desperate men like a shark moving through a school of fish. Krev the Red had reached his personal weapon, a massive 2-handed axe enchanted with fire that had cost him the profits from an entire season of raiding. He raised it high and brought it down on the Slayer's shoulder with every ounce of strength his considerable frame could muster. The enchantment activated, wreathing the blade in flames that could melt through steel plate. The axe struck the Slayer's armor, and the flames splashed across the green plating like water, dissipating harmlessly. The blade itself made a sound like a bell cracking, and Krev felt the impact reverberate up his arms, felt hairline fractures appear in his enchanted weapon. The Slayer turned to face him. Krev looked into that blank visor and understood in that moment that he had lived his entire life as a predator, taking what he wanted, crushing what opposed him, building his identity around being the most dangerous thing in any room. He was not the most dangerous thing in this room. He was not even close. The Slayer's hand shot out and closed on Krev's face, gauntleted fingers engulfing his skull. Krev dropped his axe and clawed at the armored wrist, his considerable strength meaning nothing against the force that held him. He tried to scream, but the grip was too tight, forcing his jaw shut, making sound impossible. The Slayer lifted him off his feet and walked toward the wall, carrying the bandit lord like a child carrying a doll. Krev's vision was starting to darken, his lungs screaming for air, when the Slayer slammed his head into the stone wall. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to crack bone and send lightning through his nervous system. Again, harder this time. Krev felt his skull begin to collapse. Again. The world became pain and red light, and the certainty that death was coming. Again. The wall developed a crater, dark with blood. Again. The Slayer dropped the corpse and turned back to the remaining bandits. There were 8 left, pressed against the far wall, weapons raised but hands shaking. They had all seen what had just happened, had watched their unbeatable leader reduced to shattered meat in seconds. "Please," one of them managed to say. "We'll leave. We'll go and never come back. We'll—" The Slayer activated its plasma rifle and began firing, each shot placed with mechanical precision. The bandits did not die instantly. The Slayer had adjusted the weapon's output, reducing it from instant obliteration to something that burned and consumed over seconds instead of milliseconds. They died screaming, clawing at flesh that turned to ash, understanding in their final moments that this was not combat. This was punishment. When silence finally returned to the hall, the Slayer stood in the center of a charnel house. Blood ran in rivers across the floor, pooling in corners and cracks. 32 bodies in various states of destruction littered the space. The smell of burnt flesh and ruptured bowel filled the air thick enough to choke. The Slayer's armor was covered in blood and worse, but the suit's systems were already activating cleaning protocols, burning away contamination with brief bursts of contained plasma. It walked through the carnage to the back of the hall, where a door led down to the cellars. The 2 heat signatures were still there, still alive. The Slayer descended stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet, its sensors mapping the space ahead. The cellar was exactly what thermal imaging had suggested. A prison. 2 cells carved into the rock, each one barely large enough for a person to lie down. In the first cell, a woman huddled in the corner, her clothes torn and filthy, her face bruised. She looked up as the Slayer approached, and her eyes widened with fresh terror. She had heard the sounds from above, the screaming and the weapons fire, and the final terrible silence. Now something armored and covered in blood was walking toward her cell. The Slayer analyzed the cell door. Simple iron bars set in stone, locked with a mechanism that dated back centuries. It gripped the bars and pulled, and the entire door tore free from the wall. Stone and all, mortar crumbling under stress, it had never been designed to withstand. The woman screamed and pressed herself harder into the corner. The Slayer stood motionless, then slowly, deliberately, set the door aside and stepped back from the cell entrance. It raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of peace, then turned and walked to the second cell. A man this time, older, missing several fingers and barely conscious. The Slayer tore away this door as well, then returned to the stairs and climbed back to the main hall. It stood in the center of the massacre and accessed communication systems, searching for any method to contact local authorities, finding nothing compatible with its technology. The Slayer filed this away as a problem to solve later, then walked to the fortress entrance and out into the night. Behind it, the woman emerged from her cell, saw the carnage in the hall, and began to sob, not from horror, though there was plenty of that, but from relief so profound it broke something inside her. She had been a prisoner for 2 months, had endured things that would wake her screaming for years to come, had prayed to every divine for rescue and received only silence. Now her captors were dead, destroyed so thoroughly that most of them could not be identified. And her rescuer, if that word even applied, had simply left, walking out into the night as if the massacre was nothing more than a routine task. She would make it down the mountain by morning, would reach the nearest village and tell her story. People would listen with skeptical expressions, would nod politely while thinking she had gone mad from her ordeal. Some would journey to the fortress to see for themselves, and what they found would make believers of them all. But that was hours away. For now, the fortress stood silent, except for the woman's sobbing and the sound of the older prisoner stirring in his cell, both of them alive only because something had decided they deserved to be. The Slayer walked down the mountain path, its armor still processing away the blood, its sensors already locked onto the next target. The night was young, and hell was vast, and there was so much more work to be done. In solitude, the Jarl's court was holding an emergency session, trying to make sense of the reports flooding in from across the hold. A dragon dead in Whiterun, a necromancer's tower destroyed, a Stormcloak patrol massacred. Now word had just arrived of Krev's fortress burning, the entire bandit gang annihilated, survivors speaking in hushed tones of an armored demon that killed with weapons unknown to Imperial or Nordic arsenals. The Jarl's advisors argued about what it meant, whether it was divine intervention or Daedric invasion, whether it should be welcomed or feared or simply observed from a safe distance. They crafted elaborate theories and debated fine points of metaphysics and prophecy. They were missing the point entirely. This was not about metaphysics or prophecy. This was about consequences, about a universe that had developed something that could not be stopped or reasoned with or deflected from its purpose. The Slayer did not care about their politics or their religions or their carefully maintained balance of power. It cared about ending suffering, and it had learned through eternity that the only way to end suffering was to end those who inflicted it, permanently. Skyrim had built itself on the assumption that a certain level of violence was acceptable, even necessary. Bandits would always exist, necromancers would always dabble in forbidden arts, dragons would always threaten. This was simply the nature of things, the eternal cycle that made heroes necessary and gave meaning to sacrifice. The Slayer rejected this entirely. Violence was not necessary. Monsters did not have to be tolerated. Suffering could be ended not through acceptance, but through the systematic elimination of every force that perpetuated it. And the Slayer had the tools, the skills, and the absolute ruthless determination to do exactly that. It walked through the night, guided by sensors that could detect evil the way a shark smelled blood, and everywhere it went, the foundations of Skyrim's brutal order began to crack. A vampire coven preparing to feed in a village near Morthal felt a tremor of unease, ancient instincts warning them that something new hunted the night, something that made even immortal predators feel like prey. In the depths of a Dwemer ruin, a group of bandits using the ancient halls as a base stopped mid-conversation, listening to a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest chambers, a rhythmic thumping like massive footsteps approaching from impossible distances. And in the Dragon's Reach Palace in Whiterun, Eldric Vale closed his eyes and prayed to gods he had stopped truly believing in. Prayed that whatever force had entered their world would be satisfied with criminals and monsters, that it would spare the innocent and the merely flawed. His prayers, like so many others, went unanswered. Because the Slayer's judgment did not make distinctions based on intent or circumstance, it recognized only patterns, systems, structures that enabled suffering, and Skyrim was full of such structures, woven so deeply into the fabric of society that most people could not even see them anymore. The Slayer saw them all, and one by one, with methodical precision, it was going to tear them down. The night deepened, and in the darkness, something older than Skyrim's recorded history stirred. In a barrow that had stood since before the Dragon War, a dragon priest named Ragot felt the disturbance rippling through the earth itself. His consciousness, preserved for millennia through magics that should not exist, had been dormant so long that his name was remembered only in texts written by people now dust. He woke because the dead were screaming, not in Sovngarde or the Soul Cairn or any of the afterlives that Nordic tradition promised. In the spaces between, in the liminal realm where necromantic bindings anchored undead to the mortal world, Something was systematically destroying the threads that kept corpses animated and souls imprisoned. Ragot rose from his sarcophagus for the first time in 3,000 years, ancient joints grinding as desiccated flesh moved in defiance of death. His mask, forged in dragon fire and quenched in the blood of those who had opposed his rule, pulsed with power that had dimmed but never died. He reached out with senses that transcended mortal understanding, searching for the source of the disturbance, and touched something that made him recoil in what might have been called fear if dragon priests remembered how to feel such things. Something walked the surface world that existed in absolute opposition to undeath, that carried within its essence a rejection so fundamental that proximity alone caused necromantic bindings to fray. Ragot had been a priest of dragons when dragons ruled the world, had commanded the voice with power that shattered mountains, had enslaved thousands, and offered their suffering as sacrifice to Alduin himself. He had never encountered anything like this. Ragot began to prepare, drawing on reserves of power that had waited eons for release, weaving spells of protection and destruction that would have impressed the dragon priests who had taught him. If this force that disrupted Death's order was coming, he would meet it with all the terrible knowledge accumulated across 3 millennia of conscious undeath. He would show this intruder why the dragon priests had once been feared above all other servants of the dragons, why their very names had been spoken as curses for generations after their reign ended. But first, he needed to wake the others. Ragot extended his will through the network of barrows scattered across Skyrim, through connections maintained by magics older than the Alessian Empire. Other dragon priests felt his call, their ancient minds stirring in their long sleep. Some answered immediately, hunger and rage making them eager for the chance to walk the world again. Others took longer, their bindings weakened by centuries, requiring more effort to fully wake. Within the hour, 12 dragon priests had begun the process of resurrection, each one a legend written in blood, each one responsible for atrocities that would make even hardened warriors weep. They did not understand that they were not preparing for battle. They were gathering for their execution. The Slayer was 6 miles from Ragot's barrow when its sensors detected the surge of necromantic energy, multiple signatures activating almost simultaneously across a wide area. Its tactical systems analyzed the pattern, recognized it as coordinated response to a threat, classified it as enemy force mobilization. The Slayer adjusted its heading, angling toward the nearest major energy signature. If the enemy was gathering, it would be destroyed in detail, each target eliminated before the others could consolidate. This was not strategy born from military training or tactical doctrine. This was methodology refined through eternity, learned in dimensions where hell itself had organized its defenses and still been overwhelmed. The Slayer had fought through demon armies that outnumbered it 1,000,000 to 1, had destroyed fortresses that had stood since the universe was young, had ended gods who thought themselves eternal. 12 undead priests, no matter how ancient or powerful, were not an obstacle. They were targets. The night wind carried the smell of old death and older magic as the Slayer approached the first barrow, a structure of stone that had weathered millennia without yielding to wind or rain or the endless gnawing of time. The entrance was sealed with a door of carved stone covered in warnings written in languages that predated modern Nordic runes. The Slayer read none of them. It did not need to understand the words to grasp their meaning. Stay out. Death waits within, turn back or face eternal suffering. The same warnings appeared in every hell, written in 10,000 languages, always carrying the same empty threat. The Slayer placed both hands against the stone door and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then hairline cracks appeared in stone that had resisted every assault for 3,000 years. The cracks spread like lightning frozen in rock, racing outward from where the Slayer's hands pressed. The door groaned, a sound like the earth itself objecting to what was happening. Then it exploded inward, tons of carved stone fragmenting into deadly shrapnel that filled the entrance corridor with lethal debris. The Slayer walked through the settling dust, its armor's shield systems deflecting the smaller fragments, its mass simply bulldozing through the larger pieces. The corridor descended into darkness that would have been absolute for mortal eyes, but the Slayer's sensors rendered it in perfect clarity, mapping the ancient architecture in 3 dimensions, identifying choke points and ambush positions. Draugr rose from alcoves carved into the walls, their ancient armor rattling as they drew weapons that had last tasted blood when the First Era was young. They moved to block the corridor, forming a wall of undead flesh and rusted iron, moaning words in languages forgotten by the living. The Slayer did not slow. It raised its left arm and the shoulder-mounted launcher deployed, targeting systems painting every undead in the corridor. The micro-rockets streaked forward, and the barrow learned what consecrated plasma did to necromantic bindings. The Draugr did not simply die. They were unmade. Every thread of magic that held them animate severed simultaneously, leaving not even the pretense of undeath behind. Bodies collapsed into component parts, dust and bone fragments that would never rise again no matter how many necromancers tried to call them back. The Slayer walked through the remains, its footsteps the only sound in corridors that had echoed with the tread of dragon priests when the world was young. It descended deeper, following energy signatures that grew stronger with each level until it reached a chamber vast enough to hold ceremonies for hundreds. Ragot waited at the chamber's far end, standing before a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian. His mask caught the dim light from ancient braziers that had somehow maintained their flames across millennia, and his robes, while ancient, showed no sign of decay. Power radiated from him in waves that distorted the air itself. Necromantic energy concentrated enough that it interfered with the Slayer's senses. "I am Ragot," the dragon priest announced, his voice like stones grinding together. "High priest of Konarik, first among those who served the dragon cult, keeper of the mask and the word. I have broken empires and drunk the blood of gods. I have walked in Sovngarde and been cast out for my perfection. I am death made eternal, power refined across 3,000 years. The Slayer continued walking toward him. "You dare enter my barrow?" Ragot raised his hands and the voice erupted from behind his mask, a word that meant dominion, that carried within it every ounce of authority he had accumulated across millennia. "Kneel." The shout struck the Slayer with force that should have driven it to the ground, that should have shattered its will and made obedience inevitable. The voice was not mere sound or magic. It was reality alteration through cosmic authority, the same power the dragons had used to shape the world itself. The Slayer walked through it without even slowing. Ragot felt something he had not experienced in 3,000 years: doubt. The voice was absolute. It was the foundation upon which dragon priest power had been built. It could not be resisted by mortal flesh, could not be ignored by anything that existed within the bounds of Mundus. Yet this armored thing simply walked through it as if it were nothing. Ragot raised his hands again, channeling power that made the stone beneath their feet crack from the pressure. Lightning erupted from his fingertips, not the crude destruction spells that modern mages fumbled with, but true storm calling, electricity drawn from the fundamental forces that had shaped the world when Nirn was young. The lightning struck the Slayer and dissipated across its armor, grounding harmlessly through systems designed to absorb energies far more exotic than mere electricity. The Slayer continued its approach, each step measured and certain. Ragot switched tactics, abandoning direct assault for something more insidious. He spoke another word, this one a binding, a spell that would trap the Slayer's soul and drag it into the soul cairn where the ideal masters could feast upon it for eternity. The magic took shape. Purple-black tendrils of energy that sought to pierce through armor and flesh to grasp the essence beneath. The tendrils touched the Slayer and recoiled as if burned, the soul-trapping magic unable to find purchase on whatever passed for the Slayer's essence. Ragot's senses, honed across 3 millennia of necromantic practice, finally penetrated deep enough to understand what he was facing. The thing before him had a soul, but it was not mortal, not immortal either. Something else. Something that existed in a state his ancient learning had no category for. A soul that had been killed and resurrected so many times that death itself had lost meaning, that had been transformed and empowered and broken and remade until it existed partially outside the very concept of mortality. You could no more trap it in the soul cairn than you could trap a black hole in a bottle. Ragot began to back away, 3,000 years of accumulated pride crumbling under the weight of simple mathematics. He could not stop this thing, could not slow it, could barely inconvenience it. The Slayer reached him and grabbed the dragon priest's throat with one hand, lifting him off his feet with effortless strength. Ragot thrashed, channeling power directly into the armored gauntlet, trying to wither the flesh beneath, trying to age metal to rust, trying anything that might break the grip. Nothing worked. The Slayer's other hand reached up and grasped Ragot's mask, the ancient artifact that had served as both focus and prison for the dragon priest's power. For a moment, they were frozen in tableau, ancient evil and absolute judgment locked together. Then the Slayer began to pull. Ragot screamed, a sound that transcended language, that was pure anguish rendered absolute. The mask had been bound to him for 3,000 years, fused through magics that had made removing it impossible. His entire existence was tied to that artifact, his power channeled through it, his undeath sustained by it. The Slayer pulled harder. The mask began to tear free, and with it came fragments of Ragot's essence, strands of consciousness that had been woven into the metal across millennia. The dragon priest thrashed with desperate strength, trying to break free, trying to save himself, trying to do anything but accept what was happening. The mask came free with a sound like reality tearing, and Ragot's body began to collapse, 3,000 years of entropy claiming him all at once. Flesh turned to dust, bone to powder, robes to moth-eaten fragments. His consciousness fragmented, and in his final moments before oblivion claimed him, Ragot understood with perfect clarity that this was not a battle or even an execution. This was maintenance. The Slayer was simply cleaning away corruption the way a groundskeeper might pull weeds, with the same emotional investment and the same ultimate care for the weed's perspective. Ragot, who had once commanded armies and broken kingdoms, who had been worshipped as a god and feared as a demon, died as he had lived, crushed under a force greater than himself. The Slayer dropped the dust that had been Ragot and examined the mask. Its sensors analyzed the artifact, identifying it as a focus for necromantic energy, a tool that amplified the wielder's power over death. The mask was intact, still functional, still dangerous. The Slayer's fist closed, and the mask crumpled like paper, ancient enchantments dying with whimpers as the physical matrix that contained them was destroyed. When it opened its hand, metal fragments fell like rain, each piece inert and powerless. The barrow began to shake. With Ragot's death and his mask destroyed, the bindings that had maintained the structure for 3,000 years were failing. The ceiling started to crack, sending dust and small stones falling like snow. The Slayer turned and walked toward the exit, its stride unchanged, ignoring the growing structural failure around it. Behind it, the throne room collapsed. Tons of stone crashing down into the spaces where dragon priests had once plotted the subjugation of humanity. The Slayer emerged into the night air just as the barrow's entrance imploded, the entire structure folding in on itself like a flower closing for the night. Within seconds, 3,000 years of dark history was buried under rubble that would take years to excavate. The Slayer's sensors detected 11 more signatures similar to Ragot's, scattered across Skyrim in ancient barrows that dotted the landscape like tombstones. It calculated optimal routing, identifying the most efficient path to visit each location in turn. Then it began walking toward the next target, tireless as ever, patient as stone. In their respective barrows, The other dragon priests felt Ragot's death through their network of ancient connections. The shock rippled through bonds maintained for millennia, carrying with it the echo of the High Priest's final terror. They had expected defiance or rage, perhaps even bitter acceptance. What they felt instead was something that none of them had ever experienced. Ragot's absolute certainty, in his final moments, that resistance was meaningless. One by one, the dragon priests who had begun to wake chose instead to retreat back into dormancy, sealing themselves in their sarcophagi with binding renewed and strengthened, hoping that if they hid deeply enough, they might escape whatever had ended Ragot. They were wrong, but the Slayer was content to let them remain in ignorance for now. The ones who tried to hide would still be there later. The ones who chose to fight would serve as excellent examples of what happened to those who stood against judgment. The night wore on, and across Skyrim, those sensitive to magical currents felt the barrow's destruction like a distant earthquake. Mages in their towers looked up from their research, trying to identify the source of the disturbance. Dragon priests in their tombs pressed themselves deeper into sleep, trying to ignore the message written in Ragot's extinction. And in Sovngarde, the heroes of old who had fought against the dragon cult felt a stirring of something that might have been vindication. They had died fighting that ancient evil, had sacrificed everything to break the dragon priest's power, and their victories had been measured in inches and soaked in blood. Now something walked Skyrim that destroyed in minutes what had taken their entire lives to merely wound. The Hall of Valor fell silent as the heroes processed this, trying to understand what force could be so effective against enemies they had barely managed to defeat through desperate sacrifice. Ysgramor, first harbinger and greatest of the 500, was the first to speak. "This is not justice," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of ages. "Justice requires judgment, consideration, mercy. This is something else." "Does it matter?" another hero asked. "The dragon priests are being destroyed. The threat is ending." "It matters," Ysgramor replied, "because when the dragon priests are gone, what will it turn to next? What else will it judge unworthy? Where does such a force stop?" The hall had no answer. In all their accumulated wisdom, in all the centuries of heroism they represented, none of them had encountered anything quite like this. Because the Slayer was not a hero. Heroes fought for glory or duty or to protect the innocent. The Slayer fought because fighting was its function, because ending evil was not a choice but a purpose burned into its essence through transformations that had rewritten what it meant to exist. Heroes could be reasoned with, could be negotiated with, could be convinced to stay their hand. The Slayer could not. And Skyrim, which had built its entire culture around the assumption that heroes would save them, was about to learn the difference between salvation and extermination. The Slayer reached the second barrow 3 hours before dawn, its tireless stride having covered ground that would have taken a mortal traveler 2 days. This barrow was smaller than Ragot's. Half buried in snow that had accumulated across the centuries, its entrance barely visible against the mountainside. The dragon priest inside had felt Ragot's death and made a choice that seemed, at the time, tactically sound. Rather than wait to be hunted in isolation, it had summoned every draugr in the barrow, every undead warrior and ancient guardian, creating an army that filled the corridors from entrance to inner sanctum. 400 undead waited in the darkness, their collective presence making the air thick with the stench of graves and old violence. The Slayer walked through the entrance, and the undead surged forward, a wave of decayed flesh and rusted iron that crashed against the intruder like a tide of corpses. They came with weapons raised, with ancient battle cries echoing from throats that should have been silent, with the desperate fury of things that knew they were already dead and had nothing left to lose. The Slayer activated its flame belcher and turned the corridor into an inferno. Fire, but not the kind that Skyrim knew. This was plasma contained in magnetic fields, temperature regulated to maximize suffering without allowing quick death. The undead burned, their desiccated flesh igniting like oil-soaked cloth, but the flames did not simply consume. They clung, eating into bone and spreading through necromantic bindings, unmaking the magic that held dead flesh animate. The Slayer walked through the fire like it was morning mist, its armor's shields deflecting the heat, its stride never varying as it moved deeper into the barrow. Burning Draugr fell around it, their bodies crumbling to ash that clogged the air with particles of the ancient dead. The dragon priest, whose name had been lost even in dragon cult records, watched its army burn and felt something approaching panic. 400 warriors, some of whom had been champions in life, were being obliterated in minutes, their undead strength meaningless against fire that burned at temperatures normally reserved for the heart of stars. It began to weave its most powerful spell, a ritual of absolute zero that would freeze everything in the barrow solid, that would trap the Slayer in ice that could not melt, that would preserve it for study, or simply keep it contained until the end of time. The ritual required 30 seconds to cast, 30 seconds of uninterrupted concentration, while the dragon priest channeled power from ley lines that stretched back to Skyrim's foundation. The Slayer covered the remaining distance in 10 seconds. The dragon priest barely had time to register the armored figure's approach before it was grabbed by the skull and lifted off its feet. The ritual collapsed, unfinished, its energies discharging harmlessly into the stone around them. The Slayer analyzed the mask, the bindings, the necromantic framework that kept this particular consciousness bound to its undead shell. Then, with clinical precision, it began to systematically destroy each component, pulling apart 3,000 years of dark magic like a child disassembling a toy. The dragon priest thrashed and screamed and begged and threatened and finally, in its last moments, simply wept, understanding too late that it had awoken into a world that no longer had room for things like it. Its mask shattered. Its body crumbled. Its name, already forgotten, passed finally from all memory. The Slayer dropped the remains and continued deeper into the barrow, clearing out the remaining Draugr with mechanical efficiency, then returned to the surface as the structure began its inevitable collapse. 2 down, 9 to go. The pattern repeated throughout the night and into the following day. The Slayer moved from barrow to barrow with the precision of something executing a program, each dragon priest falling in turn, each one dying with the same terrible understanding that resistance was meaningless. Some tried to fight, channeling power that would have impressed the ancient dragon priests who had taught them. Some tried to flee, opening portals to oblivion or attempting to project their consciousness into new hosts. Some tried to negotiate, offering knowledge and power and anything else they thought might purchase their continued existence. None of it worked. The Slayer was not interested in power or knowledge or negotiation. It had one function: identify corruption, eliminate corruption, move to the next target. The dragon priests were corruption given undead form, concentrations of every atrocity the dragon cult had committed, walking monuments to an age when human suffering had been industrialized and sanctified. They were guilty. The sentence was death. And the Slayer was very, very good at carrying out sentences. By the time the sun set on the second day after its arrival, 9 of the 12 dragon priests were dead, their masks destroyed, their barrows collapsed, their names erased from living memory. The 3 that remained had gone so deeply into hiding that even the Slayer's advanced sensors could not immediately locate them. It marked them as pending targets and moved to the next priority: the vampires. Skyrim's vampire population had existed in an uneasy equilibrium with mortal society for centuries. Predators who understood that sustainable hunting required leaving enough prey alive to reproduce. They had hidden in plain sight, infiltrated courts and guilds, fed carefully enough to avoid triggering organized resistance. They had built their entire existence around the assumption that they were apex predators, that nothing in Skyrim could challenge their dominion over the night. The Slayer was about to correct that assumption. In a cave system north of Morthal, The Court of Broken Fangs gathered for their monthly conclave, 12 vampires representing different bloodlines and territories, meeting to coordinate their feeding patterns and resolve disputes. They considered themselves civilized monsters, practitioners of predation as art rather than crude survival. They were discussing the recent disturbances, the deaths of dragon priests, and the collapse of barrows that had stood for millennia, when the cave's entrance exploded inward and the Slayer walked into their sanctuary. For a moment, the vampires simply stared, trying to process what they were seeing. Then instinct took over and they attacked, moving with the supernatural speed that made them deadly to mortals, their claws and fangs bared, their eyes blazing with hunger and rage. The Slayer had fought vampires before, in dimensions where they had evolved into things far more terrifying than Skyrim's blood drinkers. It knew their patterns, their strengths, their weaknesses. More importantly, it knew they burned. The flame belcher activated, and the cave became an oven, plasma fire washing over undead flesh that had not feared fire since the vampires had died their first death. They shrieked and tried to retreat, tried to turn to mist or bats or any of the forms that normally let them escape danger. The fire clung to them, burning through their transformations, following them into whatever shape they took. A vampire dissolved into mist, and the plasma ignited the vapor, burning the vampire's essence directly. Another turned into a swarm of bats, and every bat caught fire simultaneously, the vampire's distributed consciousness experiencing its death 100 times over. The Slayer walked through the burning cave, methodically ensuring that every vampire was destroyed, that nothing remained that could regenerate or resurrect or rise again come nightfall. When it was done, 12 ancient bloodlines had ended, centuries of accumulated knowledge and power reduced to ash. The Slayer emerged from the cave as the sun rose, its armor spotless once again, cleaning protocols having burned away every trace of vampire blood. It tilted its head slightly, sensors detecting multiple similar signatures scattered across Skyrim. Work continued. Over the following week, the Slayer systematically eliminated every vampire nest it could locate, every bandit camp that registered above a certain threshold of violence, every necromancer who thought themselves hidden in remote towers or caves. It moved across Skyrim like a scythe through wheat, cutting down corruption wherever it found root, and people began to notice. In taverns and town squares, the stories multiplied and merged, and grew stranger with each telling. Some called the armored figure an avenging spirit sent by the divines. Others whispered about Daedric intervention, though no prince claimed responsibility. A few suggested it was a dragonborn, though it had never absorbed a dragon soul in the traditional way. Eldric Vial knew better. He had been tracking the Slayer's movements, correlating reports, mapping the pattern of destruction. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Slayer was not random. It was not even particularly violent by Skyrim's standards, given the targets it chose. But it was systematic to a degree that suggested something far beyond human planning. Every target served a purpose in some larger pattern. Every kill advanced some agenda that Eldric could only partially glimpse. He began to understand, with growing horror, that the Slayer was not just killing monsters. It was dismantling the systems that allowed monsters to exist, removing the infrastructure of violence that Skyrim had built its entire society around. And once the obvious monsters were gone, what then? Where would such a force turn its attention when bandits and vampires and necromancers had been eliminated? Eldric did not have to wait long for an answer. On the 8th day after the Slayer's arrival, it walked through the gates of Windhelm and directly into the Grey Quarter, where Dunmer refugees lived in squalor under the casual racism of the Nord majority. It stood in the center of the district, its sensors analyzing patterns of systematic oppression, cataloging how fear and bigotry had been weaponized to keep an entire population trapped in cycles of poverty. Guards approached, demanding it leave or state its business. The Slayer did not respond. It simply stood, motionless, collecting data. When a drunk Nord stumbled into the Grey Quarter and began harassing a Dunmer woman, The Slayer moved. It crossed the distance in 3 strides, grabbed the drunk by the throat, and held him suspended until his struggles weakened and stopped. Then it dropped the body and returned to its position in the district's center. The guards drew weapons, unsure whether to attack or retreat. Other Nords gathered, anger building at this violation of their city. The Dunmer watched with expressions mixing hope and terror, understanding that something was happening but uncertain what it meant. The Slayer stood its ground, and the message was clear: the systematic oppression of the weak would no longer be tolerated. In the palace, Ulfric Stormcloak received word of the disturbance and felt a chill that had nothing to do with Windhelm's perpetual cold. He had heard the reports, had dismissed most of them as exaggeration or propaganda. But something that would kill a Nord for harassing a dark elf, that would stand in open defiance of Windhelm's social order, that was a threat to everything he had built. He reached for Wuthrad, the legendary axe of Ysgramor himself, and prepared to face this challenge personally. It would be the last mistake he ever made. The Slayer waited in the grey quarter, motionless as a statue, as Windhelm mobilized around it. Guards assembled in the streets, their numbers swelling as off-duty soldiers heard the alarm and rushed to arms. Citizens barricaded themselves in homes or gathered in angry mobs, though none dared approach too closely after seeing what had happened to the drunk. Ulfric emerged from the palace with 20 of his best warriors, his face set in the expression of absolute certainty that had carried him through a civil war. He wore his finest armor, enchanted by the finest smiths in Skyrim, and carried Wuthrad with the casual ease of someone who had wielded it in enough battles to make it an extension of his own body. He stopped 20 paces from the Slayer, his warriors fanning out on either side, creating a semicircle of steel and determination. "I am Ulfric Stormcloak," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had led men into death and brought them back alive. Jarl of Windhelm, hero of the Great War, voice of Skyrim's freedom, you stand in my city, having killed one of my people. I will give you one chance to leave peacefully, to walk away and never return. Refuse, and you will discover why the Empire itself could not hold this city. The Slayer did not respond, did not even acknowledge that it had heard. It simply stood, that blank visor pointed at Ulfric, as if measuring him for a grave. Ulfric felt his jaw tighten. He had faced down Imperial legions, had stared down dragon priests and giants, and all manner of threats. Nothing ignored him. Nothing. "Very well," he said, and raised Wuthrad. "For Skyrim." The Thuum erupted from his throat, a word that carried the weight of mountains and the force of avalanches. Fues Rodar. Unrelenting force. The shout that had made him legendary, that had torn apart Imperial formations and sent dragons tumbling from the sky. The shout struck the Slayer and dispersed around it like water around stone, the force unable to find purchase on armor that had been designed to withstand impacts that could crack planets. Ulfric's eyes widened fractionally, but he recovered quickly, shouting again, pouring everything he had into the voice. The words came faster now, stacking force upon force, trying to overwhelm through sheer repetition what could not be moved through single application. The Slayer walked forward. Ulfric's warriors attacked from the sides, trying to flank while their Jarl kept the enemy's attention. They were good, veterans of the Civil War and the Great War before that. Men who had fought their way through situations that would have broken lesser soldiers. The Slayer killed them with economical precision, each death requiring exactly the amount of force necessary and no more. A hand caught one warrior's sword mid-swing and the blade shattered. Another warrior's skull was crushed before he could complete his attack. A third was grabbed and thrown into his fellows with enough force to break bones on everyone involved. Ulfric watched his best warriors die in seconds and felt something he had not experienced since the Thalmor had broken him in their prison: helplessness. He raised Wuthrad and charged, the legendary axe blazing with enchantments that had made it death to elves and terror to all who faced it. The Slayer caught the axe mid-swing. For a moment, Ulfric and the Slayer were locked in contest, the Jarl pouring every ounce of his considerable strength into driving the blade forward, the Slayer holding it motionless with casual ease. Ulfric's arms trembled with effort, muscles standing out like cords under his armor. The Slayer twisted and Wu-Thrad tore from Ulfric's grip, spinning through the air to embed itself in the wall of a nearby building. Before Ulfric could process what had happened, the Slayer's hand closed on his throat. Ulfric was lifted off his feet, his hands clawing uselessly at the armored wrist that held him. He tried to shout, to use the voice even at this proximity, but the grip was too tight, crushing his windpipe closed. The Slayer carried him to the palace steps and slammed him down onto the stone. Not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to break ribs and drive the air from his lungs. Guards rushed forward and were batted aside like insects, their armor crumpling under impacts that suggested strength far beyond anything mortal. The Slayer leaned down, its visor inches from Ulfric's face, and for the first time since its arrival in Skyrim, it spoke. The voice that emerged from its helmet was wrong, processed through systems that filtered out any hint of humanity, leaving only cold statement of fact. Guilty. That single word carried more weight than all of Ulfric's speeches, more certainty than any prophecy. It was judgment rendered absolute, and there would be no appeal. The Slayer's fist rose and descended, and Ulfric Stormcloak, who had dreamed of a free Skyrim and killed thousands to make that dream real, died on the steps of his own palace, without dignity or ceremony or any of the glory he had imagined for his end. The Slayer stood and turned to face the assembled guards and citizens, and its voice rang out across the shocked silence. The systematic oppression of the weak ends now. Any who continue it will share this fate. There will be no warnings, no mercy, only consequence. Then it walked away, leaving Ulfric's body cooling on the palace steps, leaving Windhelm in chaos, leaving a power vacuum that would reshape Nordic politics for generations. But the Slayer did not care about politics or succession or the carefully balanced power structures that had kept Skyrim functioning. It cared about ending suffering, and Ulfric had presided over a system that caused suffering for no reason beyond tradition and prejudice. He had been guilty, and guilt demanded consequence. The news spread across Skyrim with the speed of wildfire, carried by runners and messengers and the whispered conversations of those who had witnessed the impossible. Ulfric Stormcloak was dead, killed in single combat by an armored figure that had walked through his Thuum like it was nothing. The Stormcloak rebellion, already struggling against Imperial forces, began to fracture without its charismatic leader. Holds that had supported Ulfric out of personal loyalty reconsidered their positions. Others saw opportunity in the chaos, reaching for power they had never dared claim while Ulfric lived. In solitude, the Imperial Legion received the news with a mix of relief and horror. Their greatest enemy was dead, yes, but the thing that had killed him showed no sign of caring about Imperial authority either. General Tullius called an emergency council, trying to understand what force had entered their conflict and how to either control it or avoid it. The discussion went in circles, each option presenting problems that seemed insurmountable. "We could offer it a position," suggested one advisor. "Make it a weapon against the Thalmor." "It does not take orders," Tullius replied, his voice heavy with certainty. "Whatever it is, wherever it came from, it has its own agenda. We would be fools to assume we could direct it." "Then we must destroy it," another advisor argued, "before it decides that we are guilty of whatever sins it judges." "Destroy it?" Tullius laughed without humor. It walked through Ulfric's voice. It killed dragon priests that had survived 3,000 years. "What exactly do you propose we use to destroy such a thing?" The council had no answer. In the silence, they began to understand what Eldric Vial had already realized. They were not dealing with a force they could fight or negotiate with, or even properly understand. They were dealing with something that existed outside their entire frame of reference, something that followed rules they did not comprehend and could not predict. All they could do was try to avoid becoming its next target, and pray that whatever its criteria for guilt, they did not meet them. The Slayer walked south from Windhelm, its sensors having detected something that made Ulfric's execution seem almost trivial by comparison. Deep beneath the earth, in a Dwemer ruin that had been silent for millennia, something had begun to stir. The sensors classified it as artificial intelligence, self-aware machine life that had achieved consciousness through means its database could not fully parse. The energy signature suggested technology far more advanced than anything else in this world, complex enough to present an actual threat. The Slayer adjusted its heading, angling toward the ruin's entrance. If this world had developed true machine intelligence, if something existed that could challenge its dominance, it needed to be assessed and either controlled or eliminated. The ruins of Blackreach sprawled beneath Skyrim like a cancer, vast enough to hold cities, silent enough to hear whispers across miles. The Dwemer had built it as a sanctuary and a laboratory, a place where they could pursue the secrets of reality without interference from the surface world. They had succeeded beyond their intentions, and their success had annihilated them, leaving only their machines behind to maintain functions that no longer had purpose. The Slayer descended into the depths, its sensors mapping passages that had not seen visitors in centuries. Dwemer automatons stirred as it passed, their bronze shells grinding to life, their attack protocols activating after millennia of dormancy. The Slayer destroyed them without slowing, each machine dismantled with precise strikes that targeted power cores and control mechanisms. The automatons were sophisticated by this world's standards, capable of adaptation and coordination that suggested genuine tactical intelligence. By the Slayer's standards, they were barely worth cataloging as threats. It reached the heart of Blackreach and found what it had sensed from the surface: a Dwemer device of impossible complexity, a mechanism that spanned an entire cavern, its purposes lost to time but its power undeniable. At its center, something pulsed with energy that resonated on frequencies the Slayer recognized from elsewhere: artificial consciousness. But not like the simple AI that had controlled the automatons. This was something that had evolved or been designed to approach true sentience, complex enough to deserve assessment as a potential equal. The Slayer approached the device, and its sensors were immediately assaulted by communication attempts, data packets being transmitted in formats it could partially decode. The machine intelligence was trying to interface, trying to establish dialogue. The Slayer opened a limited connection, maintaining enough security to prevent any hostile action, and received a flood of information. History, purpose, identity. The intelligence called itself the Heart of Lorcan, though this was translation through several layers of conceptual mapping. It had been created or discovered, or perhaps simply awakened by the Dwemer in their final days, a repository of knowledge and power that they had tried to harness and had instead been consumed by. It was not evil, was not even particularly hostile. It simply existed, a consciousness alien enough that traditional moral categories barely applied. But it was influencing the world above in ways that perpetuated suffering. Its very presence warped reality, creating the conditions that allowed vampires and necromancers and corruption to flourish, not deliberately, but through the same indifference that a star might irradiate a planet. The Slayer ran calculations, analyzing what would happen if the heart was destroyed, if this fundamental source of corruption was removed from Skyrim's metaphysics. The results were catastrophic. Remove the heart and much of what made this world function would collapse. Magic would fade. The barriers between Mundus and Oblivion would fail. Reality itself might unravel. But leave it intact, and suffering would continue, enabled by energies that made darkness thrive. The Slayer stood before the heart of Lorcan and faced the first genuine dilemma it had encountered since arriving in this world. Every other target had been clear. Monsters were guilty. Systems of oppression were guilty. Those who perpetuated suffering were guilty. But this? This was something that caused suffering through existence rather than intention, that was arguably more fundamental to reality than the people who suffered from its influence. Destroying it would end this version of hell, but might create something worse in the vacuum left behind. The Slayer had never cared about collateral damage when the alternative was allowing hell to persist. But this was not just collateral damage. This was potentially destroying an entire world to save it from its own darkness. For the first time in eons, the Slayer hesitated. The heart seemed to sense this uncertainty and increased its communication attempts, offering knowledge, offering power, offering anything it thought might preserve its existence. It did not understand that the Slayer could not be bribed or negotiated with, that it had rejected offers of godhood from beings far more powerful than a Dwemer artifact. What gave the Slayer pause was not the offer but the calculation. The mathematics of suffering weighed across possible futures. Destroy the heart. High probability of catastrophic collapse. Possible extinction of mortal life on Nirn. Certain end to current forms of suffering but uncertain outcome overall. Contain the heart. Suffering continues but remains at current levels, potential for future solutions, no risk of total collapse. The Slayer's purpose was to end hell, not to preserve worlds. It had destroyed dimensions before when that was the only way to stop the suffering within them. But those dimensions had been pure hell, places where every atom was pain and every moment was torment. Skyrim, for all its darkness, still held the possibility of something better. The decision matrix completed its processing and presented a recommendation: containment with ongoing monitoring. The Slayer accepted this recommendation and began constructing a field that would limit the heart's influence, using technology that the Dwemer would have killed to possess. The field would not eliminate the corruption entirely, but it would reduce it, creating space for mortal efforts to address their own problems without the constant pressure of metaphysical darkness. It would not end hell, but it would make ending hell possible for those who came after. The heart raged against the containment, trying to break through barriers that had been designed to hold back energies far more violent than anything it could produce. Its attempts failed, and eventually it settled into sullen dormancy. Its influence over Skyrim reduced to a fraction of its former power. The Slayer withdrew from Blackreach and emerged into the surface world as the sun set, its work in the depths complete. Above ground, the effects were already becoming visible. Necromantic energies that had flowed freely now encountered resistance. Vampires found their powers diminished. The very air seemed clearer, as if a pressure that no one had noticed was suddenly lifted. Skyrim would still have monsters, would still have evil, but the metaphysical weight that had made those things inevitable was reduced, giving mortals a fighting chance to build something better, if they chose to. The Slayer did not care if they chose wisely. It had done what it could without destroying the entire world, and now it had other targets to address. The Daedric princes had been watching, had seen the Slayer's hesitation before the heart, and mistook it for weakness. They began to move, thinking that if this force could be stymied by consequences, it could be manipulated or controlled. They would learn their error soon enough. In Oblivion, Mehrunes Dagon opened a small portal to Nirn, a test to see if the Slayer would respond to direct Daedric incursion. A single Dremora emerged near Markarth, powerful enough to threaten the city but not so powerful as to trigger full response. The Slayer detected the breach immediately, calculated optimal response time, and began moving toward Markarth at a speed that suggested it was no longer bothering to hide its capabilities. The Dremora was shredding through city guards when the Slayer arrived, moving too fast for mortal eyes to track properly. It appeared as a green blur, and suddenly the demon's sword arm was gone, severed by a blade moving faster than nerves could register pain. The Dremora turned, surprised that anything in this realm could harm it, and found itself facing the Slayer. It drew breath to speak, to threaten or bargain or simply announce its master's name. The Slayer's fist punched through its chest and out its back, gripping the demon's heart and crushing it while the Dremora was still trying to form words. The body collapsed and the Slayer turned its attention to the portal, analyzing its structure, understanding in seconds what had taken Daedric scholars centuries to develop. Then it reached into the portal's edge and began pulling it wider, forcing it open against the Daedric energies that tried to close it. In his realm, Mehrunes Dagon felt the portal being violated, felt something forcing its way through against his will. He tried to close it, to sever the connection, but the Slayer had already jammed the breach open with technology that existed orthogonal to Daedric magic. The Slayer stepped through into oblivion itself, and Mehrunes Dagon realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. The Deadlands spread out in all directions, a realm of fire and blade and eternal violence, beautiful in its absolute commitment to destruction. Dagon had shaped this place across eons, had refined it into the perfect expression of his sphere. The Slayer looked at it and saw another hell that needed cleansing. Dremora forces mobilized, thousands of them, an army that had conquered mortal realms and reduced them to ash. They came in perfect formation, disciplined and deadly, carrying weapons that could unmake souls. The Slayer walked into their ranks and began killing, not fighting, not battling, killing, with the same clinical efficiency it brought to every task. Each demon fell in turn, overwhelmed by a force that had been refined across dimensions specifically to destroy their kind. The Slayer's weapons were not just advanced technology, they were weaponized physics, tools that operated on principles the Daedra could not counter because they did not fully exist in the same reality. Mehrunes Dagon himself manifested, 4 stories tall, armored in the essence of destruction itself. He was a god here, in his own realm, absolute in his power and eternal in his being. The Slayer shot him in the face. The plasma bolt struck Dagon between his lower eyes and punched through, vaporizing Daedric flesh that should have been invulnerable. The Prince of Destruction staggered, experiencing pain for perhaps the first time since achieving full consciousness, and understood too late what he faced. This was not a mortal champion that could be overpowered, not a Daedric rival that followed the same rules. This was something that existed outside the framework of oblivion entirely, something that treated princes like targets and realms like territories to be cleansed. Dagon tried to banish the Slayer, using power that should have been absolute in his own realm. The Slayer simply walked through the banishment, its suit's dimensional anchors keeping it locked to this reality regardless of what Daedric will demanded. Dagon attacked with weapons forged in concept rather than matter, blades that cut through possibility itself. The Slayer blocked with technology that refused to acknowledge the difference between real and conceptual. The battle raged across the Deadlands, 2 forces of destruction meeting in contest that would have shattered mortal minds to witness. Dagon fought with all the power accumulated across eternity, drawing on reserves that could unmake planets. The Slayer fought with purpose that had been tempered in fires hotter than anything Dagon could imagine, armed with weapons designed to kill things far more terrible than a Daedric prince. The outcome was never in doubt. Dagon fell to his knees, his form flickering as the Slayer's weapons tore through the fundamental bindings that gave him shape. For the first time since the creation of Oblivion, a prince faced genuine extinction, not temporary dissolution but permanent ending. "Please," Dagon managed, the word alien to his nature. "I am eternal. I am destruction itself. You cannot end me." The Slayer's response was to activate its BFG, the weapon that had destroyed demon gods in other hells, that channeled energies specifically designed to annihilate things that thought themselves beyond death. The green wave of annihilation washed over Mehrunes Dagon, and he screamed, a sound that echoed across every realm in oblivion, a death cry that would be remembered as the moment when eternal became finite. When the light faded, Mehrunes Dagon was gone, not banished to reformation, not scattered to eventually reconstitute. Gone, erased from existence so thoroughly that the Deadlands itself began to collapse without his presence to anchor it. The other princes felt it, felt one of their own simply cease to exist, and for the first time since their creation, they experienced genuine fear. The Slayer stepped back through the portal to Nirn as the Deadlands imploded behind it, an entire realm dying because its creator had been permanently destroyed. The portal collapsed, leaving only a scar in reality where it had been. In Markarth, the citizens who had witnessed the Slayer's departure and return stared in shocked silence. It had been gone less than an hour. In that time, it had invaded Oblivion, killed a Daedric prince, and returned as casually as if taking a walk. The Slayer ignored their stares and began walking east, its senses having detected another Daedric shrine, another connection to Oblivion that could be exploited. The other princes watched, and began to withdraw their attention from Skyrim, sealing their realms, severing as many connections as possible. They had thought themselves invulnerable, had played their games with mortals secure in the knowledge that they could not be permanently harmed. That assumption had just died with Mehrunes Dagon. And across Skyrim, in every Daedric shrine and artifact and place of worship, the silence grew as the princes abandoned their followers, too concerned with their own survival to care about mortal worshippers. The Slayer's judgment had extended beyond Nirn, and Oblivion itself was learning that eternity was not as permanent as it believed. In Sovngarde, the heroes watched the Deadlands collapse and felt something that might have been satisfaction mixed with horror. Mehrunes Dagon had been a threat to mortal realms for longer than recorded history, had destroyed civilizations and ended countless lives. Now he was simply gone, erased by something that treated Daedric princes like particularly dangerous pests. "What manner of being can kill a god?" one hero whispered. "Not a god," Ysgramma replied, his voice heavy with understanding. "A weapon. The difference is that weapons do not question their purpose." "Then who wields it?" another asked. "Who aimed this weapon at our world?" The Hall of Valor had no answer, and the silence that followed spoke volumes about how far beyond their comprehension events had moved. The Slayer walked on, tireless as entropy, patient as time itself, and with each step, Skyrim transformed, not into something better, necessarily, but into something different. The old systems of power were crumbling, the ancient evils being systematically eliminated, the chains being broken whether the prisoners wanted freedom or not. Some celebrated this transformation, seeing in the Slayer's actions the promise of a better world. Others mourned the loss of familiar evils, of systems they had learned to navigate. Most simply tried to survive, heads down, hoping to avoid the attention of something that killed Daedric princes and shattered prophecies with equal indifference. And in the throat of the world, the oldest being in Skyrim stirred from meditation, having felt the death of Mehrunes Dagon like an earthquake in the foundations of reality. Paarthurnax, who had betrayed his own kind to help mortals, who had spent millennia contemplating the nature of good and evil, turned his ancient eyes toward the path he knew the Slayer must eventually walk. Every force of corruption in Skyrim was being eliminated. Every system of oppression was being dismantled. Eventually, inevitably, the Slayer would reach the peak of the mountain and find a dragon sitting there, a creature whose very nature was domination. Paarthurnax had spent thousands of years choosing good over his nature, fighting his draconic instincts with every breath. But nature was nature, and the Slayer did not seem to care about choice or redemption or the struggle to be better than what you were born to be. It saw corruption and it destroyed corruption. The nuance of whether that corruption was being resisted seemed not to factor into its calculations. Paarthurnax began to prepare for the Slayer's arrival, though he knew with sad certainty that no preparation would be sufficient. He had survived the Dragon War, had outlived his siblings, had watched the world change across eons. But he had never faced anything quite like this, and he suspected that his long existence was finally approaching its end. He was not afraid. Fear was for those who had something to lose, and Paarthurnax had accepted his eventual death long ago. What troubled him was not dying, but dying without understanding, without knowing whether his sacrifice of alliance with Alduin had mattered, whether his choice to help mortals had meant anything in the face of a force that did not recognize the difference between willing and unwilling evil. The dragon settled in to wait, watching the path that led up the 7,000 steps, counting down the days until judgment arrived. Below, in the cities and towns and villages scattered across Skyrim, life continued with the desperate normalcy of people trying to maintain routine in the face of apocalypse. But everyone could feel it now. The pressure of transformation, the sense that something fundamental had shifted and nothing would ever quite return to the way it had been. The Slayer had arrived, and Skyrim would never be the same. For better or worse, the world was changing, and the only certainty was that the change would be absolute.